The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, as though it had absorbed the emotions of everyone seated within its walls. The room, lined with polished wood panels and bathed in the golden glow of overhead lights, bore the kind of silence that was not empty, but loaded like a pause before a storm. Every creak of a chair, every whisper between spectators seemed magnified. It was not just a trial. It was the kind of moment where the weight of truth itself seemed to hang in the balance. The case had gripped the community for months. News outlets had labeled it the trial of the year. Outside the courthouse, camera crews and journalists, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their microphones ready to catch even the smallest scrap of commentary. Inside, the gallery overflowed with curious citizens who had lined up since dawn, eager to witness justice unfold. Many of them didn't know the victim's family personally, yet they felt invested, pulled in by headlines, shocked by whispered rumors, and compelled by a story that seemed stranger than fiction. At the center of it all sat the defendant, a man in his 30s with a polished suit and a carefully rehearsed expression of calm. His eyes scanned the courtroom, but when they landed on the jury, they carried something colder, an attempt at persuasion mixed with defiance. He was accused of a crime so chilling that the community had been left shaken, though he had proclaimed his innocence again and again. Evidence suggested otherwise. Still, his lawyers, sharp and relentless, had worked hard to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. The prosecution, for their part, leaned heavily on both forensic details and the testimony of witnesses. Yet cracks in the case had begun to show. Witnesses contradicted each other. Certain pieces of evidence seemed circumstantial. More than once, the jury had looked uncertain, leaning forward with furrowed brows, as if struggling to untangle fact from performance. But among all these adults, the lawyers, the judge, the journalists, there was one figure who seemed strangely out of place: a child. She was barely 3 years old, small enough that her legs dangled from the courtroom bench without reaching the floor. She clutched a soft toy in one hand, a quiet comfort against the unfamiliarity of the setting. Her big brown eyes shifted constantly, observing everything with a seriousness that seemed unusual for her age. She did not fully understand the gravity of the trial, yet in her silence there was a sense of watchfulness, as though she was noticing things others missed. Beside her sat her guardian, a woman in her 50s who had been entrusted with the child's care after tragedy. She held the toddler close, occasionally smoothing her hair, whispering reassurances. To most of the courtroom, the little girl was invisible. Too young to testify, too young to process the layers of justice and guilt being debated. The judge had permitted her presence only because her guardian insisted she would not disturb the proceedings. At the front of the room, drawing a different kind of attention, was the police canine, a German shepherd with sleek black and tan fur. The dog lay on the ground beside his handler, a veteran officer with years of service. The dog's presence was routine canine South, often accompanied officers in court, but still, he carried an air of quiet authority. His head rested on his paws, yet his eyes remained sharp, scanning the room as if understanding far more than most gave him credit for. Occasionally, his ears twitched at the sound of raised voices, but otherwise, he was still a sentinel in fur. Some jurors couldn't help but glance at the dog now and then, perhaps reassured by his calm, perhaps unsettled by the thought of what he had witnessed during the investigation. This particular German shepherd had played a key role in gathering evidence. To the trained eye, his presence was a reminder of the invisible threads connecting this trial to events beyond these walls. But to the toddler, seated just a few benches away, he was something more. Her eyes followed him closely, almost magnetically, with the kind of fascination only children show when they feel instinctively safe around an animal. The judge entered, his black robe swaying as he took his seat. A gavel struck wood with a sharp crack, jolting the room into silence. Proceedings began, voices rising and falling, with legal arguments that twisted through the air like tightly knotted rope. The prosecution laid out its points. The defense countered with poise. Each side was skilled, but beneath the surface, nerves rippled. The case wasn't airtight, and everyone knew it. The journalists scribbled furiously, trying to capture each dramatic exchange. This trial could go either way, one whispered. The jury looked split. Another shook her head. People want closure. They need to see justice done. The words weren't loud, but the tension in the room made even. Whispers feel amplified. Meanwhile, the toddler fidgeted, her toy clutched tighter as she swung her legs. She was young, but she wasn't oblivious. Her gaze moved from the stern faces of the lawyers to the calm police dog, then to the man seated at the defense table. She tilted her head, studying him with the unfiltered honesty only a child possesses. There was no calculation in her stare, no hidden agenda. Just an unspoken question, an instinct that children often feel when something isn't right. Her guardian noticed and gently squeezed her shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured. The little girl nodded, but kept watching. Across the aisle, the police dog suddenly lifted his head, as though sensing her eyes on him. Their gazes locked, child and animal. For a moment, the noise of the courtroom seemed to dim, leaving only the quiet understanding between the two. The girl's lips curved in the faintest smile, and the German shepherd's tail gave a subtle thump against the polished floor. No one else noticed. It was too small a gesture in the midst of legal drama. But for the child, it was a moment of recognition, a spark of connection that would soon grow into something no one could ignore. The first day of testimony passed slowly, punctuated by objections and cross-examinations. Witnesses came and went, each adding their piece to the puzzle, but the bigger picture remained blurred. By late afternoon, the courtroom was weary, the weight of hours pressing down on everyone. Still, the toddler sat quietly, her eyes bright and focused in a way that seemed unusual for her age. To most in the room, she was a forgotten observer, just a child whose presence was incidental. But as the judge called for recess, as the jury shuffled out and reporters rushed to phone in updates, the German shepherd glanced once more at the little girl. His gaze lingered, unblinking, as though he understood something the rest of them didn't. And in that silent exchange, between an innocent child and a loyal police dog, the seeds of revelation were planted. Seeds that would, in time, crack open the trial in ways no one present could have imagined. For now, the world carried on with its legal procedures, its arguments, its evidence files. But destiny had already shifted. The courtroom just didn't know it yet. The courtroom came alive again the next morning, buzzing with energy before the judge even entered. The journalists were already in position, cameras poised outside the courthouse, reporters scribbling pre-trial notes with practiced anticipation. This was not just a trial anymore, it had become theater. And like all theater, people expected drama. The prosecution prepared their files, stacking papers and reviewing their witnesses. The defense team sat polished and confident, whispering strategy to their client, who wore the same neutral mask he had perfected. The jury shuffled in, carrying the silent burden of deciding truth. Every detail mattered now, the tone of a voice, the hesitation in an answer, the smallest flicker of emotion across a face. Yet in the midst of all these serious figures, the little girl sat almost invisible. Her guardian held her hand, gently smoothing her hair as the child's legs swung above the polished floor. She was not part of the official proceedings. She could not raise her hand to swear an oath, could not stand in the witness box. By law, her age disqualified her from testifying, and so she became what many dismissed her as a bystander, too small to matter. But to her, everything mattered. Children often notice what adults overlook, while the lawyers fought over technicalities, and the jury scribbled half-legible notes. The toddler watched with wide, unblinking eyes. Her gaze lingered not on the documents, but on people, their posture, their tone. The subtle shifts they thought went unnoticed. She tilted her head, studying the accused with quiet curiosity. He never looked at her directly, though when his eyes drifted in her direction, his expression seemed to harden. She didn't understand why, but instinctively she felt uneasy about him. Her toy, a small stuffed rabbit, rested in her lap. She squeezed it when the voices in the courtroom grew sharp, but her eyes rarely wavered from the police dog at the front of the room. The German shepherd sat poised, a living reminder of the investigation that had led here. His handler, Officer Daniels, kept him steady, but even Daniels could sense the faint electricity in the air whenever the child's gaze met the dog's. No one else paid attention. The trial pressed forward with methodical rhythm. The prosecution called its witnesses neighbors, experts, officers who had combed through evidence. Each testified with gravity, yet the defense dismantled their words with precision. A neighbor's memory was questioned, an officer's procedure scrutinized, an expert's confidence shaken. The defense lawyer, tall and sharp-tongued, had a way of twisting questions until the witnesses faltered. Piece by piece, the prosecution's case seemed to weaken. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Some leaned toward the defense's argument. "It's all circumstantial," one man muttered. "Not enough to convict." Another shook her head. "No, there's more to it. You can feel it." The divide in opinion mirrored the divide on the jury's faces. But the little girl was not confused. She watched the man at the defense table, noticing the way he tapped his finger when certain evidence was mentioned, how his jaw clenched when the police dog shifted his position. She noticed things not written in the transcripts, things adults dismissed as unimportant, yet which spoke volumes to her. At one point, the prosecutor introduced a photograph of the crime scene. The lights dimmed as the image appeared on a projector. The courtroom leaned forward. The little girl's grip on her toy tightened. She did not look at the screen, though her eyes flicked toward the dog. The German shepherd's body stiffened almost imperceptibly, his ears pricking as though remembering. It was only for a second, but she saw it, and she filed it away silently. When the lights returned, the judge addressed the jury, reminding them of their duty to focus only on facts, not feelings. The child didn't understand all his words, but she understood tone. His was firm, commanding, but beneath it, she sensed something else, a weight, perhaps even doubt. Even the judge, cloaked in authority, carried uncertainty. During a recess, the gallery stirred with restless energy. Reporters rushed outside to update their stations, typing furiously on laptops, dictating sound bites into microphones. "The prosecution's case looks shaky," one said. "Unless they bring something stronger, the defense could turn the tide." Another countered. "But the jury saw that picture. That'll stick." Meanwhile, the little girl sat quietly, nibbling on a cracker her guardian had tucked into her bag. She swung her legs again, eyes never straying far from the front, where the police dog now rested, his head on his paws. To anyone else, he was calm. To her, he was waiting. She couldn't explain how she knew it, but she did. When court resumed, the defense called their own witnesses. Friends of the accused painted him as trustworthy, reliable, incapable of such crimes. Their voices were smooth, their faces rehearsed in confidence. Some jurors nodded, others frowned. The tide shifted again, leaning slightly toward the defense's favor. The prosecutor scribbled notes furiously, clearly unsettled. Through it all, the little girl remained silent, her presence unnoticed. To the adults in the room, she was a spectator too young to matter. But she was also the only one who noticed how the dog's gaze followed the accused with unusual intensity. Whenever the man shifted, so did the shepherd's head. Whenever his name was spoken, the dog's ears flicked. And whenever the child glanced at the animal, she saw recognition mirrored in his eyes. The connection deepened quietly, unnoticed by anyone else. By late afternoon, fatigue weighed on the room. A jury slumped slightly in their seats. The lawyers' voices carried the rasp of overuse, and even the judge's gavel strikes seemed slower. Yet the little girl remained awake, alert. To her, the courtroom was not boring. It was alive with things adults ignored. She leaned closer too, her guardian whispering something softly, but her words were drowned in the shuffle of papers and the shuffle of feet. The day ended without resolution. The judge dismissed the jury, instructing them not to discuss the case outside. The gallery emptied in waves, conversations spilling into the hallway. Reporters hurried to broadcast their impressions, highlighting the defense's strength, the prosecution's struggle. Outside, the crowd of onlookers debated passionately, everyone sure of their own interpretation. Inside, however, the little girl lingered a moment longer. She looked once more at the police dog. His gaze found hers across the distance. Unflinching, steady. The child tilted her head, as if listening to something unspoken. Then she nodded. Just once, as if to say, "I understand." Her guardian tugged her gently toward the exit. "Come on, sweetheart. Time to go." To everyone else, she remained the forgotten observer, a child too small to matter. But in her heart, she knew she had seen something no one else could see. And soon, the courtroom would too. The third day of the trial dawned gray, the sky above the courthouse heavy with clouds that promised rain. Reporters huddled beneath umbrellas, their voices sharp with excitement as they delivered updates to cameras. Today could be pivotal. One said into her microphone, "The prosecution is desperate for a breakthrough, and the defense is pressing harder than ever. The stakes have never been higher." Inside the courtroom, the mood was even heavier. Jurors filed in slowly, carrying notepads and weary expressions. The judge adjusted his glasses, settling behind the bench with the weight of duty pressing into his shoulders. The attorneys prepared themselves, their faces masks of calm determination. And once again, the little girl sat quietly beside her. Guardian, almost overlooked in the chaos. But she was not distracted. She had been watching, always watching. The morning began with another witness, an officer who recounted the search of the crime scene. His words were steady, but the defense's lawyer cut through them with surgical precision. Questions twisted into traps, and answers were made to seem uncertain. By the end, the officer looked shaken, and the defense smirked as if they'd landed another victory. The jury's faces remained hard to read. Some scribbled notes. Others leaned back, arms crossed, their brows furrowed. The prosecution shifted in frustration, their case unraveling in threads too thin to hold together. The child, however, paid little attention to the arguments. Her focus, as always, lingered on the German shepherd at the front of the room. He lay beside his handler, Officer Daniels, his posture still, but his presence commanding. Every now and then his ears flicked, or his tail gave the faintest thump. To others, these movements were nothing. To the girl, they were signals, quiet, wordless messages only she seemed to hear. She tugged at her guardian's sleeve. "Doggie's talking," she whispered softly. The guardian smiled gently, smoothing her hair. "He's just listening, sweetheart." But the girl knew better. Children often do. By midday, the courtroom grew restless. The defense pressed their advantage, calling another witness to testify in the accused's favor. The man on the stand spoke of friendship, loyalty, and trust. His voice was polished, practiced, but his eyes flickered nervously when the prosecutor cross-examined him. Still, the defense managed to protect him, leaving the jury with doubt rather than certainty. Then it happened. During a pause in testimony, while the lawyers exchanged notes, the girl suddenly shifted in her seat. Her gaze, sharp and unblinking, was fixed on the police dog. He had risen slightly, his body tense, ears pricked toward the defense table. His amber eyes, piercing and unwavering, locked onto the accused. It wasn't aggression. It was recognition, something deeper, older, like memory surfacing in silence. The child gasped softly, as though she, too, felt it. She slid from her guardian's lap before the woman could stop her. A murmur rose from the gallery as the toddler, so small and fragile, toddled down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. Some gasped, others chuckled nervously, thinking it was a child's mischief. The judge opened his mouth to intervene, but then hesitated, his gavel hovering midair. Something about the moment felt different. The little girl walked straight toward the German shepherd, her toy rabbit clutched in one hand, her steps steady despite the sea of eyes watching her. Officer Daniels stiffened, instinctively tightening the leash, but the dog didn't move. Instead, his tail gave a slow wag, and his head tilted, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. The child stopped in front of him. For a long moment, she simply stared, her wide eyes meeting his. Silence swept across the courtroom, stretching thin like glass, about to shatter. Then she smiled. Without fear, she reached out her tiny hand and placed it gently on the dog's head. The German shepherd closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her touch with a sigh so deep it seemed to carry the weight of everything he had seen, everything he knew but could never say. The gallery erupted in whispers. "Did you see that? The dog knows her. What's happening?" The judge cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Order in the court." But even his words carried less authority than usual, ground beneath the swell of emotion filling the room. The child turned, looking back toward the rows of adults. Her guardian's face was pale with shock, her hand pressed to her chest. Officer Daniels, too, looked rattled. He had worked with this dog for years, trusted him with his life, but he had never seen him respond this way. Not to a stranger, not in a place so charged with tension. The accused shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening around the edge of the defense table. For the first time, his mask slipped, his jaw clenched, his gaze darting away from the child and the dog. And the jury noticed. It was a moment that no transcript would ever capture, no cross-examination could unravel. A child and a dog, connected in silence, speaking a truth too pure to be dismissed. The girl leaned closer, whispering something only the dog could hear. His ears twitched, his gaze softened, and then he turned his eyes once more toward the accused. The room held its breath. The judge finally found his voice. "Officer Daniels, restrain your dog. Guardian, please retrieve the child." But even as the guardian rushed forward, scooping the little girl into her arms, the moment had already changed everything. The jury's faces were different, now leaning forward, alert, stirred in a way that testimony alone had failed to achieve. The forgotten observer had become the center of the room. Back in her guardian's arms, the child nestled against her shoulder, still watching the dog with quiet certainty. She didn't understand legal battles or closing arguments, but she understood trust. She understood recognition. And in her heart, she knew the dog had remembered something important, and she had been the only one to notice. The judge banged his gavel, trying to restore order, but the stillness that followed wasn't the same as before. This silence was alive, trembling with expectation, as though the air itself knew that what had just happened was more important than any testimony given so far. And though the day ended with more arguments, more evidence, more witnesses called to the stand, no one in that courtroom could shake the image of the tiny child standing before the towering German shepherd, their bond radiating a truth that no one could deny. The silent recognition had spoken louder than words, and it was only the beginning. The fourth day of the trial began under a strange hush. The courthouse, usually buzzing with chatter and camera shutters, felt subdued, as if everyone sensed that something unusual was coming. Inside, the jury filed in quietly. The reporters, normally quick to whisper commentary, instead sat poised with pens hovering, their eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom. Even the accused seemed restless, shifting in his chair, his hands clasping and unclasping against the smooth wood of the defense table. The memory of the previous day lingered like a ghost. The image of a child walking down the aisle, laying her hand on the German shepherd's head, the dog leaning into her touch as if he had been waiting for her. No one could explain it. Lawyers dismissed it as coincidence. The judge insisted it meant nothing legally, but the jury could not erase it from their minds. The little girl, too, carried the moment with her, sitting beside her guardian, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She was quieter than usual, her expression serious. Her guardian stroked her hair gently, whispering, "Just sit still, sweetheart. Just watch." The woman's voice carried reassurance, but there was worry too. She had seen the way the courtroom shifted when the girl approached the dog, and she feared what might happen next. The police dog, lying once again at Officer Daniel's side, seemed more alert than usual. His golden eyes scanned the room, sharp and unblinking. Every time the accused moved, the shepherd's ears pricked slightly, his gaze narrowing. Daniels noticed, tightening the leash with a subtle tug, though the dog never growled, never barked. He was too disciplined for that. Still, there was something restless beneath his stillness, something that set even the seasoned officer on edge. The trial pressed forward with its usual rhythm, witnesses called, questions asked, objections raised, the gavel striking. But beneath the legal structure ran an undercurrent, an unspoken awareness that something had shifted since the child's approach the day before. By mid-morning, the defense lawyer rose again, his voice smooth and confident. He gestured toward the accused, painting him as a man wrongfully burdened, a victim of misunderstanding. His words flowed like silk, crafted to persuade. He spoke of doubt, of uncertainty, of holes in the prosecution's story. And for a moment, some of the jurors seemed to nod, their pens pausing mid-note. But then the dog stirred. It was subtle at first, his head lifting, ears pricked, body tensing. His gaze locked once more on the accused, unblinking, steady as stone. The child noticed immediately. Her little hand tightened around her toy, her lips parting slightly. She could feel it, the same thing she had felt yesterday, that unspoken recognition between them. And then, before her guardian could stop her, she slid off the bench again. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the child padded down the aisle, her small shoes tapping against the polished wood floor. The judge frowned, gavel poised, but did not interrupt. Something about the moment held even him captive. The girl walked past the lawyers, past the jurors, straight toward the German shepherd. Once again, Daniels instinctively tightened the leash, but the dog remained calm, tail giving a faint wag, as if welcoming her. She reached him, placed her hand on his head, and then turned, not toward her guardian, not toward the gallery, but toward the judge. Silence fell. The child's voice was soft, but it carried. "He knows." 2 words. They hung in the air, like thunder, though spoken barely above a whisper. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed frozen. The jurors stared, mouths slightly open. Reporters' pens hovered mid-air. Even the defense lawyer's words crumbled into silence, his carefully crafted argument dissolving in the face of a child's innocence. The accused shifted violently in his chair, his face paling. He looked at the child as though she were a ghost, something he could not control or predict. His hands gripped the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The judge blinked, his voice catching. What did she say?" The guardian rushed forward, her face flushed. "Your Honor, please, she's just a child." "But—" The girl repeated herself, louder this time, pointing a tiny finger at the dog. "He knows." The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, voices colliding in disbelief. "Did you hear that? What does she mean?" "The dog knows." The tension exploded into chaos until the judge slammed his gavel down again and again. Order! Order in the court! But no amount of gavel strikes could erase the moment. The prosecutor stood, seizing the opportunity. "Your Honor, this child's words may not be official testimony, but they cannot be ignored. She has been present through these proceedings, and clearly, she has recognized something the rest of us have overlooked." The defense lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! This is absurd. She's 3 years old. This is nothing but childish imagination. You cannot allow this to sway the jury." But the jury was already swayed. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the child and the dog. The innocence of her words cut deeper than any legal argument could. Officer Daniels shifted uneasily. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." The judge hesitated, then nodded. Daniels gestured toward the shepherd. "This dog has worked with me for years. He has been trained to detect, to alert, to protect. During the investigation, he consistently reacted in the presence of the accused. We couldn't use it as hard evidence. It doesn't hold up in court, but it was enough to guide our search. Enough to uncover evidence we might have missed." The courtroom held its breath. The child, still standing beside the dog, nodded as though confirming his words. She patted the shepherd's head, her face calm, certain. The accused's composure cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his lips pressed thin. For the first time, the mask of innocence he had worn so carefully faltered. And the jury saw it. The judge leaned back, exhaling slowly. His gavel rested on the desk, unused. His eyes, sharp and weary, studied the accused with a new weight. "He knows," the girl whispered one last time, softer now, as if speaking only to herself. But everyone heard it. The moment stretched endlessly, echoing through the walls of the courtroom, imprinting itself into every mind present. Those 2 words, so simple, so childlike, carried more weight than hours of testimony. They were not evidenced by the book, but they were truth, pure and undeniable. The trial had shifted. And though proceedings continued, though lawyers argued, and objections flew, nothing felt the same. The jurors no longer looked at the accused with uncertainty. Reporters scribbled with renewed frenzy, knowing they had witnessed something unforgettable. The gallery leaned forward, hearts pounding. And in the center of it all stood a child, her hand resting on the head of a German shepherd, her voice echoing in every corner of the room. 2 words had cracked the silence wide open. 2 words had changed everything. The judge's gavel slammed down with a sharp crack that echoed off the marble walls, demanding order. But the courtroom was no longer the same measured space it had been just moments earlier. A ripple of whispers surged through the benches like a wave, rising louder despite the judge's insistence for silence. "He knows?" The phrase passed from one set of lips to another, spreading like wildfire. The 2 words spoken by a child had rattled the most composed legal minds in the room, and no one knew what to do with them. The defense attorney was the first to regain his composure. Rising swiftly, his face tightened into the familiar mask of control, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Your Honor," he began, his voice sharp and practiced, "this is absurd. We cannot allow the ramblings of a toddler to hold weight in a court of law. Children of that age are prone to fantasy. They mimic, they exaggerate. They do not testify with credibility. He gestured toward the little girl, who sat innocently with her guardian, her tiny hands folded in her lap. But no one in the room, not even the jurors, was looking at the attorney. Every eye was fixed on the child and the German shepherd sitting at the officer's side. The dog's ears twitched, his gaze steady, as if he were aware of the sudden gravity he now carried. The little girl leaned slightly toward him, unafraid, her earlier words still lingering in the silence like an unshakable truth. The prosecution, sensing an opening, stepped forward. "With all due respect, counsel," the prosecutor said firmly, "you may dismiss the child's words as nonsense, but what you call fantasy, others recognize as clarity. This child has no reason to fabricate. She does not comprehend the strategy of winning or losing a case. Yet her statement aligns with the evidence we've been presenting, that this dog, Officer Rex, consistently indicated the defendant's involvement." The jury stirred. Their earlier expressions of fatigue and skepticism had vanished. Now they leaned forward, some with narrowed eyes, others with faint nods, as if the child's 2 words had shaken them awake. The judge sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. He was a man seasoned with decades of trials, familiar with theatrics, but this moment was different. He could sense it in the air, the way the jurors' attention had shifted, the way silence clung, tighter than any cross-examination could achieve. He cleared his throat. "This court recognizes the unusual nature of what has just occurred," he said slowly, his voice deep and deliberate. "But it also acknowledges the truth often reveals itself in unexpected ways. We will proceed cautiously." The defense attorney pounced. "Cautiously?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "Your Honor, we are opening the door to chaos. Allowing a child's imagination to influence proceedings is reckless." "What's next? We let a dog take the stand?" A chuckle spread across the gallery, quickly hushed by the gavel. Yet even the humor only underlined the seriousness of the moment. The defense's words sounded desperate, not confident. The officer handling the dog shifted uneasily, then stood. "Permission to speak, Your Honor?" he asked. The judge gave a nod, and the officer's voice, though steady, carried a subtle tremor of emotion. This little girl's words, they may not be testimony in the legal sense, but they strike at something we all felt during this investigation. Rex, this dog, alerted every single time we approached the defendant. His instincts have solved more cases than I can count. And today, this child, who is too young to be coached into lies, looked at him and said what we all know. He knows. That is not coincidence. The officer's words sank deep into the room. Jurors exchanged glances, several biting their lips as if holding back tears or thoughts they couldn't voice. Even one of the bailiffs shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking from the accused to the child. The defendant himself sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, sweat gathering at his hairline. He avoided looking at the dog, staring instead at the table before him. To anyone watching closely, his stillness looked less like composure and more like fear. The guardian of the child leaned forward, speaking softly to the court. "She remembers more than you think," the guardian explained, voice quiet but steady. "She can't describe it in full sentences yet, but she remembers the dog. She remembers the moment. And in her mind, that dog carries the truth she cannot yet explain. She isn't inventing. She's recognizing." The defense lawyer slammed his hands on the table. "Speculation. This is all speculation." He barked, but his voice cracked ever so slightly, betraying his frustration. The judge silenced him with a single glare. "You will have your chance to cross-examine," he said coldly. In the back row, a reporter scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Headlines were already forming in his mind. Child's 2 words rock courtroom. Police dog becomes silent witness. He could sense the story's magnitude. This was not just another trial. This was history unfolding in a way no one anticipated. Meanwhile, the jury's focus had shifted entirely. They were no longer just weighing technical arguments. They were feeling the pulse of the room, the raw humanity, the innocence of a child colliding with the weight of justice. And innocence, they realized, carried more power than any lawyer's theatrics. The defense scrambled to regain control, pacing in front of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, trying to smile, "you're letting yourselves be swayed by theatrics. A child pets a dog, and suddenly we're calling it evidence. That is not law. That is not justice. Justice is built on facts, not fairy tales." But his words fell flat. The jurors didn't nod. They didn't lean back. They sat firm, their eyes fixed not on him but on the little girl, who was now quietly stroking the dog's fur, calm and unshaken. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Justice is also about truth," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "And sometimes truth arrives through unlikely messengers. A child's innocence, a dog's instinct. Together, they point in the same direction. We can dismiss them as coincidence, or we can recognize them for what they are, the pieces of a puzzle that no lawyer, no matter how skilled, can erase." Silence followed, heavy and unbroken. Even the defense attorney had no immediate reply. The jurors absorbed the words, their expressions telling a story of their own, doubt toward the defense, belief growing in the prosecution's case, and above all, the image of that little girl's two words echoing in their minds. "He knows." It was not evidence stamped on paper, nor was it sworn testimony. But it was something deeper, something undeniable. It had cut through the noise of arguments, through the posturing of attorneys, and landed directly in their hearts. As the judge called a recess to restore order, people rose from their seats, buzzing with conversation. Some whispered that the child was guided by something beyond reason, others that the dog had become the true witness of the trial. Regardless of the theories, one thing was certain. The case was no longer just about facts. It had become a story of faith, instinct, and innocence, standing against calculation and deceit. And in that transformed courtroom, everyone knew the trial's direction had shifted forever. The courtroom remained hushed, as though everyone was holding a collective breath. Moments ago, the toddler had pointed at the German shepherd and spoken two words that seemed too simple to carry weight, yet had shaken the entire trial. "He knows." Those two syllables now hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore, even by those who wanted to dismiss them as childish imagination. The judge leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple, as though weighing the consequences of letting such a moment influence the proceedings. "Order," he commanded, though his voice lacked the firmness it carried earlier in the trial. Something about what had just happened had unsettled him in a way that decades on the bench had not prepared him for. The guardian, a middle-aged woman sitting just a few feet from the child, looked torn between pride and fear. Pride that the little one had found her voice, and fear that those innocent words would now be scrutinized, twisted, or dismissed by men and women who lived their lives in the cold world of law. The officer who held the dog's leash tightened his grip, sensing the weight of the moment. His partner, the dog, sat tall, alert, eyes fixed not on the crowd, not on the accused. A quiet growl rumbled in the shepherd's throat, so low it was barely audible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of the accused man's neck stand. He shifted uneasily in his chair, pulling at his collar, avoiding the gaze of both the child and the animal. The defense attorney was the first to break the silence. He pushed back his chair, the screech of metal against wood echoing loudly in the chamber. "Your Honor," he began, trying to inject disdain into his voice, "this is ridiculous. We cannot allow the ramblings of a 3-year-old child to sway this court. She has no capacity to testify, no understanding of the situation. The judge's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He was waiting. The air remained tense. The guardian rose slowly, holding the little girl's hand as though steadying her against the weight of so many stairs. Her voice was steady, but thick, with emotion as she explained, "Your Honor, my niece, she remembers things. Not everything, not in ways adults do. But she remembers feelings, and she remembers that night. The only thing she trusted completely was that dog." A ripple spread across the room. The officer glanced down at his partner, then up at the bench. He knew it was time to speak. Clearing his throat, he addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, if I may, this dog isn't just any dog. He has been my partner for 5 years. He has tracked narcotics, rescued missing children, and, in this case, was integral in the investigation." The jury turned their attention to him, hungry for something beyond legal jargon. The officer continued, his voice carrying conviction. "When we searched the suspect's property, my dog alerted consistently at the same locations tied to the crime. Evidence that was nearly overlooked was uncovered because of him. And even here, now, you can see he recognizes something in that man. He doesn't act this way with everyone." The shepherd's tail flicked once, but his gaze remained locked on the accused, who had now gone pale, beads of sweat glistening on his temple. The defense attorney jumped to his feet again, voice rising. "Objection. This is absurd. You're trying to let a dog convict my client. Dogs cannot testify. Dogs cannot prove guilt. This is speculation and nothing more." But the jury wasn't looking at the lawyer. They were staring at the child, who had now knelt beside the dog, resting her small hand gently on his fur. She wasn't afraid, not even in a room filled with tension, not even under the heavy gaze of strangers. The judge raised a hand to quiet the room. "Objection noted," he said. His eyes, however, betrayed curiosity. Something was happening. That went beyond his control, beyond the control of attorneys and procedure. The guardian's voice softened, but it carried across the courtroom. "She doesn't have the words for what she saw, Your Honor, but she has this connection. She knows the dog knows the truth, and she trusts him in a way that can't be coached, can't be faked." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Reporters' pens hovered above notepads. Jurors leaned forward in their seats. And then, unexpectedly, the child spoke again. Her voice was small but clear, cutting through the thick air. "He helped me," she said, patting the shepherd's neck. "He helped me when I was scared." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The officer swallowed hard, his own composure threatening to break. He remembered that night, the chaos, the search, the moment they found the terrified little girl, clutching her toy under the bed, and the shepherd crawling into the small space first, nudging her gently until she came out. That was the night she first met him, the night her trust was sealed. The officer's voice cracked as he added, "Your Honor, this child isn't fabricating. I was there. My partner was the first to reach her. And since that night, she has never once wavered in her trust for him. If she says he knows, then to her he does. And maybe we should all start listening." The defense scoffed, pacing the floor, but their arguments were starting to sound hollow. No legal trick could erase the raw truth unfolding in front of them. A child's innocence and a dog's unwavering loyalty were shining brighter than any carefully rehearsed testimony. The accused, now visibly shaken, refused to meet anyone's gaze. His hands fidgeted on the table, his jaw clenched tight. The dog growled again, a low, instinctive sound, and the man flinched. The jury caught it. So did the judge. What the guardian had feared was true. The child's words were being picked apart, analyzed, doubted. But something remarkable had happened. The courtroom wasn't just hearing the words anymore. They were feeling them. The power of innocence had pierced through layers of doubt and defense, forcing everyone to see the case in a new light. By the time the gavel struck again, demanding order, the damage, or perhaps the miracle, was already done. The courtroom had shifted. The trial was no longer just about evidence on paper. It was about trust, about an undeniable bond between a girl and a dog who carried the truth that no one else could speak. The accused's mask was beginning to crack, and though he said nothing, the fear in his eyes betrayed more than any testimony could. The tension in the courtroom had shifted from curiosity to something sharper anticipation. What had started as a child's innocent words now pressed like a spotlight against the accused, a heat he could no longer escape. He sat rigid in his chair, but his every twitch betrayed the storm inside him. His eyes darted from the girl to the German shepherd, then back to the jurors, as though searching for anyone to believe his innocence. The German shepherd didn't move. He sat tall, a statue of discipline, but his unblinking stare was a weight on the accused. It wasn't aggressive, not even hostile, it was steady. And that steadiness was somehow worse. It was as though the dog was silently saying, "I remember. I know what you did." The defense attorney tried to regain control. His voice, which had carried arrogance earlier in the trial, now cracked with strain. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, pacing quickly, "we must not allow emotion to cloud judgment. This is law. This is justice. Not superstition about a dog's instincts or the fantasies of a toddler. You have sworn to weigh facts, not feelings." But the jurors' faces told another story. They weren't looking at the attorney anymore. Their eyes lingered on the girl kneeling beside the shepherd, her tiny hand tangled in his thick fur, and on the accused, who seemed unable to sit still under the weight of it all. The prosecutor rose, slowly, deliberately, and approached the bench. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to remind the jury of something critical. Facts did bring us here. Facts unearthed by this dog locations he signaled, items he uncovered, evidence that matched the timeline of the crime. Without him, this child might never have been found alive. Without him, we would not even be standing in this courtroom." He let the words sink in, his eyes flicking toward the accused. And now, even in this chamber, his instincts remain unchanged. He reacts only to one man. This is not superstition. This is consistency. And consistency is the very backbone of truth. The accused's jaw worked furiously, as though chewing back a retort, but none came. His throat bobbed, and his fingers tapped rapidly against the table. A nervous tick, it drew more attention than he intended. The judge shifted forward in his seat, his hand resting thoughtfully against his chin. The gavel remained untouched. This wasn't a moment to silence. This was a moment to witness. The child's guardian tried to pull her gently back to their bench, but the girl resisted, her wide eyes locked on the accused. Her voice rang out again, fragile yet fearless. "You're the man," she said. The entire courtroom froze. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Even the reporters, who prided themselves on detached observation, felt their pens shake. The accused's head snapped toward her, his face contorting between rage and panic. "She's lying." He spat suddenly, his first real outburst of the trial. The words echoed in the chamber, harsh and jagged. But no one seemed convinced. A grown man raging against a 3-year-old child only made him look more cornered, more exposed. The shepherd's growl rolled like thunder this time, deeper, sharper. The officer holding the leash tightened his grip, but even he looked stunned by the timing of it. The dog wasn't trained to growl in court. He wasn't trained to react, unless there was genuine recognition or threat. The accused slammed his hands on the table. "You can't let this happen." You can't let a dog and a baby decide my fate." His voice cracked with desperation, sweat streaming down his temple. He turned on his attorney, grabbing his sleeve. "Do something. Stop this." The attorney recoiled, his composure unraveling. With his clients. "Sit down," he hissed under his breath, but the command went ignored. The prosecutor stepped forward again, his tone cutting but calm. "No one is asking this child or this dog to replace evidence. But what we are witnessing is something that cannot be faked. Fear is hard to control, Your Honor, and we are watching. Fear unravel this man before our very eyes." The jury exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, others scribbled notes furiously. But all of them had noticed the same thing. The accused wasn't afraid of the jury, or the lawyers, or even the judge. He was afraid of the dog and the child. The judge finally raised the gavel and struck once, sharp enough to restore silence. "Order. This court will proceed with dignity." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a quiet astonishment. "Continue," he said to the prosecutor. The prosecutor nodded and turned, addressing the accused directly now. "Mr. Fenton, you've denied all allegations. You've insisted you were never at the location in question, never near this child. Yet your body betrays you. You can't even look at her without snapping. You can't even hear a dog growl without trembling. Why is that?" "I'm not trembling." The accused barked back, his face flushed, but the tremor in his hand betrayed the lie. The shepherd barked suddenly, one sharp, commanding sound that reverberated through the chamber. The officer, holding the leash, looked startled, but he didn't silence his partner. The bark had landed like a gavel of its own, as though punctuating the prosecutor's question. The girl whispered, almost to herself, but loud enough for the room to hear, "He remembers." The accused shot up from his chair. "Enough!" His voice cracked, the words tumbling out louder than intended. His attorney lunged to pull him. Back down, but the damage was already done. The jury's eyes widened. The judge's gavel slammed again and again. But no one could unhear what had slipped, the tone, the panic, the rawness of guilt breaking through the mask. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. The accused sank back into his chair, but it was too late. His chest rose and fell in erratic bursts, his composure shattered. He muttered under his breath, fragments of words the microphone barely caught. "Didn't mean to, wasn't supposed to." The prosecutor froze mid-step, his ears straining. The officer's eyes widened. The jurors leaned closer. Even the judge leaned forward. The fragments were incoherent, but they were enough to draw suspicion closer to confession than any evidence had so far managed. The defense attorney tried desperately to cover the cracks. "Your Honor, my client is under extreme emotional stress. This spectacle, the theatrics of animals and children, it's manipulation." He was shouting, flailing now, his authority disintegrating before the very jury he needed to persuade. But the damage had been done. The room was no longer on his side. The girl clutched the shepherd's neck, pressing her cheek against his fur, safe in his presence. And in that quiet gesture, the jury saw what mattered most: trust. Pure, untainted, uncoached trust. The accused sat slumped now, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for escape. The German shepherd didn't move an inch. He didn't need to. The weight of his stare alone was enough to hold the man captive. For the first time since the trial began, it was no longer a question of whether the jury would believe the prosecutor's evidence. It was now a question of when the accused's mask would fully break, and whether he'd confess before the verdict forced it out of him. The cracks were there, and they were spreading fast. The courtroom was silent, so silent that the creak of the judge's chair seemed louder than thunder. Every eye was fixed on the bench, every ear tuned to the next words, that would determine the fate of the man who had sat through the trial in nervous stillness. The jurors filed back into their seats, their faces solemn, their body language tight with the weight of responsibility. They had deliberated long, carefully weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and most of all, the shocking moment when a child's innocent voice had pierced the court with the unforgettable words, "He knows." The judge adjusted his glasses, his gaze steady yet softened. It was not often that a trial carried with it such an undeniable emotional weight. The clerk rose and read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words sent a ripple through the room. Gasps escaped, whispers swirled, and in one corner, quiet sobs broke out as the victim's family clutched one another in relief. For weeks they had prayed for justice, but doubt had haunted their nights. Now, as those words rang through the chamber, their grief carried a different shape, no longer heavy with uncertainty, but lightened by the assurance that truth had prevailed. The accused slumped in his chair, his earlier defiance gone. He avoided the gaze of the jury, the victim's family, and most especially the police dog sitting only a few feet away. The German shepherd's ears stood tall, his eyes unblinking, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Some whispered it looked as if the dog understood the verdict, that he had carried the truth in his watchful eyes long before the rest of them caught up. And then, almost as if orchestrated by fate, the 3-year-old girl, tiny, fragile, yet so unshakably brave, stood up. Her guardian tried to hold her back, but the judge raised a hand, granting silent permission. She toddled forward, her shoes making soft taps against the polished floor. Everyone held their breath. Reporters stopped scribbling. The defense attorney, pale with defeat, lowered his head. The child walked straight toward the dog, who greeted her with a gentle wag of his tail. She leaned into him, hugging his strong neck, and whispered softly, "Good boy." The sound was barely audible, but it carried across the courtroom like a hymn. It wasn't just a child speaking to a dog. It was the embodiment of trust, of truth, of innocence recognizing justice. The judge's throat tightened as he watched, and even the most hardened officers in the room blinked back tears. The officer handler, a man who had worked alongside the dog for years, swallowed hard as he knelt beside them both. He did his job, the officer said, voice low but firm. And so did she. His hand gently rested on the child's shoulder. The image of the little girl and the loyal K9 side by side would stay with him forever. The judge, trying to maintain composure, tapped his gavel lightly. "Court is adjourned," he announced, though his tone lacked the sharpness of routine. Instead, it held reverence, as though he too recognized this was no ordinary case. This was not simply the end of a trial. It was the beginning of a story that would live far beyond the courthouse walls. Outside the courtroom, the world erupted. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing as headlines began to write themselves. Toddler and police dog unite in courtroom drama, 2 words that changed everything. Innocence brings justice. The guardian shielded the child as best she could, but the little girl, unfazed, clung to the German shepherd as though he were her anchor in a sea of chaos. People on the courthouse steps wept openly. Strangers who had only come to observe found themselves hugging, as though sharing a collective moment of humanity. The victim's family approached the guardian, bending to thank the child through tear-stained faces. "You gave us strength," one whispered, voice trembling. The child smiled shyly, not fully understanding the enormity of her role, but somehow knowing she had done something good. In the days that followed, the story spread across the nation. News broadcasts replayed the footage of the child, pointing at the dog, her voice echoing those haunting words. "He knows." Social media erupted with tributes. Artists painted portraits of the little girl hugging the German shepherd. Songs were written, poems shared, essays published. To many, it wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was proof that truth often hides in the simplest of places, carried by the voices least expected. Psychologists, legal experts, and community leaders debated the implications. Could a child's intuition be trusted? Could the testimony of innocence outweigh the complexities of law? Yet, no matter the intellectual debates, one fact remained. Without that little girl's words, the trial might have ended differently. The German shepherd, already respected as a K-9 officer, became a symbol of loyalty and truth. Children sent letters addressed to him, decorated with paw prints and hearts. Schools invited the handler and his dog to speak about courage and justice. And wherever they went, people leaned down to whisper those same two words to the dog, almost as if passing along a secret only he could truly understand. He knows. The girl, though too young to grasp the full magnitude of her actions, carried on with her life in quiet innocence. Her guardian often reflected on that day, marveling at how such a small voice could shake the walls of power. Sometimes, the guardian told friends, God chooses the smallest instruments to play the loudest notes. For the judge, it was a trial he would never forget. In private moments, he admitted to colleagues that no legal textbook had ever prepared him for that day. Justice had come not through procedure, but through purity, through a child and a dog, who reminded the world that truth needs no embellishment. Months later, the officer handler retired the German shepherd from active duty. He's done more than enough, the officer said proudly at a small ceremony. The dog received a medal for his service, but more importantly, he received the lifelong devotion of the community he had served. And when the little girl attended that ceremony, running to embrace him once more, the crowd erupted in applause. It was not just applause for a dog or for a child. It was applause for what they represented: innocence, trust, and the undeniable power of truth. Years would pass, but the story never faded. It was told in classrooms, recounted at dinner tables, and written about in newspapers long after the trial had ended. Some remembered it as the day justice was served. Others remembered it as the day a child and a dog taught a lesson no law book ever could. But for those who had been inside that courtroom, it was something more profound. They remembered the hush that fell when the child spoke, the way the dog seemed to bear the weight of truth, and the way a room full of adults, judges, lawyers, officers, and strangers had been humbled by the simplest of voices. Because in that room, justice had not come from arguments or evidence alone. It had come from purity, from innocence, from the unshakable trust between a child and a dog. And that, more than any verdict, was the legacy left behind.